You ever look at Arnold Schwarzenegger's training and think to yourself, this is an absurd amount of training volume? And that's because it is. If you've ever tried it, you might have been one of the lucky few that stuck with it for a few weeks or even a few months. But eventually, no matter who you are, it beat you down. It happens to the best of us, myself included. But one thing you might not know, Arnold, even himself, he wasn't immune to this. Despite what you've read or you heard online, Arnold actually didn't sustain this type of training very long. In fact, he's even gone on record saying that up to the last month before a contest, he was brutally overtrained and just fighting to keep his muscle mass on. Now, you're likely not going to hear about any of this in any of his books or any of the publications. But the truth is, Arnold, even himself, he knew he couldn't keep up that crazy high volume, high frequency split of training year round. In fact, as soon as the contest was over, things would change drastically. And I'm going to outline what that looked like for you, so that you can learn a little bit more about what his training was actually like, but most importantly, how this actually applies to you. I want you to understand that Arnold, and pretty much anybody that you see in these magazines, didn't necessarily build the majority of the mass following those workouts. That was generally what they did right before a contest. And what Arnold actually did in the off season, that was actually much more in line with basic old school mass gain training. So even arguably the most aesthetic bodybuilder of all time, the poster boy for using 5, 10, or even more sets per exercise, focusing on every little detail, he also understood that that method was more for polishing his physique rather than building the muscle and mass. But more importantly, when he did want to build some serious mass, he relied on much more basic, heavy, progressive training. So take notes and apply this to your training if you want to add more muscle and add more mass. So Arnold would basically break up his training into roughly 3 to 4 phases of training throughout the year. This all depended on what was going on. But in general, as soon as that contest was over, Arnold would actually take a few weeks off from training from the gym. He might go on a few posing exhibitions after the Olympia. He might be traveling around the world. But either way, he would let his body rest during this time. Before he went fully into the off season, he would give his body a bit of a rest. Now, after this quick break, Arnold would pick back up his training, but start with the least amount of exercises and the least amount of sets in the gym. His training would consist of roughly just 2 exercises per body part. For chest, that might be something like the flat bench press and flies. For the back, pull-ups and rows. During this phase, Arnold has mentioned that he would generally do around 10 sets max per muscle group. That would be 5 sets of flat bench, 5 sets of flies. That would be all he would do for chest. That's it. Now, for some of you guys, I know what you might be thinking. You're probably saying 10 sets? That's really not low volume. Well, I agree. If you compare it to the height of his training, you'll easily see that that's just a fraction of the amount of work he would normally perform. During this phase, Arnold would also follow a very basic set and rep protocol. One of the most common ones he would use is the basic 5 sets of 10 repetitions. And earlier in his career, and when he was really focusing on adding mass with bigger compound lifts, he might perform 5 sets of 6 repetitions. Either way, the goal here was basic progression. A very common method back then was just to perform the same exercises over and over again. Over time, your goal is just to simply increase load. Now, Arnold would continuously do this throughout the first 2 to 3 phases of training. Once he entered the second and third phase, he'd do the same thing, but he'd add more sets. If he was previously performing 10 sets per body part in the first 2 to 3 months of training, during the next phase, he'd now bump that up to 15 sets per body part. This second phase of training was basically a period of time where he would gear himself up to begin his Olympia Prep. As you increase training volume, your work capacity increases, your general fitness increases, and it would, in Arnold's case, leave him in striking distance to start performing those crazy high volume, high frequency workouts. Now, as soon as the Olympia Prep would begin, Arnold would bring out every tool he had in his toolbox. He would increase his training to hit body parts 3 times per week. He would incorporate double split training where he'd train in the morning and come back again in the evening. He would be in the gym 6 to 7 days per week. And during that time, he'd hit each body part multiple times, up to 3 times per week with many exercises. Each body part would get hit with roughly 20 sets at the bare minimum and possibly a lot more. This style of training is ultimately what many of you have seen online or read in his books. But all these publications really seem to leave out the fact that this was in fact just his pre-contest training. And Arnold himself even admitted once the contest would end, his body couldn't possibly keep up with that amount of work. While Arnold might not have looked at it this way, what he was performing back then, that's just basic yearly periodization. It's no different of a model than many athletes perform, whether that be Olympic athletes, team sports, or any other sport. And many of you guys, and I'm personally guilty of this myself in my younger years, you all look at that pre-contest style of training and you think, this is what I need to do to build muscle. The truth is, the real muscle was actually built in phase 1 or even phase 2. It's that period of time where the volume's not necessarily low, but rather it's moderate, and more importantly, the training is simplified. The training is basic, the training is progressive, and you're repeating those same movements over and over again, focusing on basic progressive overload. The fact is, that style of training, it's not sexy. It's boring. It can be monotonous, and it doesn't really sell. This is why many of the magazines just really didn't even include it. But what this style of training does actually do is it works well. It works very well. And to me, that's the stuff that I personally enjoy doing when it comes to training. Focusing on the basics, getting bigger, getting stronger, and every year progressing and moving towards my goals. And if you want to consistently add mass to your frame, you need to save that fancy fluff and pump work. First, hammer those foundational basics. Support your training with sufficient calories and protein, focus on progressing, and more importantly, beating your previous best over and over again. Give it some time, and most importantly, that's how you turn someone who's weak and small into someone massive with the strength to back it up. And if you need the training programs to get started, make sure to check out my mass gain programs down below. And as always, if you want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.